Thank you everyone for joining us tonight for our virtual community engagement workshop. We're really excited to have you here. We're going to be talking about ways that gardens can engage people who are living in their neighborhood, either through completely virtual ways, through social distance ways, and a hybrid of both. It's a very difficult time for lots of community gardens because they have been these beacons of community. They've been open spaces that people can come in, whether they're members, whether they're neighbors, and they do a lot of programming for the neighborhood. So it's been really hard for a lot of our gardens who haven't been able to be open during this time. And tonight we're going to talk about some ways that gardens have been working to engage their community and maintain that very important connection with their neighbors during this time. And so what we're going to do is we'll talk a little bit about some of the current policy GreenThumb has around events and move a little bit further into some examples of ways that we can move forward as we wrap up the season. Great. Casey, can you go to the next slide? Thanks. So policies are forever changing as we figure out the way that we can communicate and be in community together in a safe way. So we're going to talk a bit about our current policies. Then we're going to have a little breakout group. We're pretty small right now, so we'll probably just all chat together about ways we've engaged with people in the past as a community garden group and ways that we can do it going forward during this time. And we'll talk about some examples of virtual engagement, things that are happening right now on the ground with lots of gardens. So it's been tried and tested. So we have a few best practices for you and some resources you can use as you move forward in planning events, whether it be for the rest of this season or looking towards next year. Okay. You can go on to the next slide, Casey.
All right. And so for our friend from LA, this is only relevant to us in New York City, but we wanted to talk quickly about what community gardens in New York City on Parks property can and cannot do during this time during the pandemic. So garden groups that are on Parks property in New York City are now allowed to host public events with prior approval from GreenThumb by filling out an event request form that's available on our website or by talking to their outreach coordinator in case they don't have regular access to the internet. So right now we're capping attendance at all approved events at 25 people or less, depending on the size and the layout of the garden. There must be a garden member on site at all times to make sure public health requirements are observed by all the attendees. And due to the ongoing pandemic, we'll also have garden groups affirm that they agree to follow all COVID-19 procedures and practices. Event details, which should always be the case, should be agreed upon by the garden group following whatever their decision-making processes are as a group. And then just to note that internal garden meetings and work days, any situation where you're not going to necessarily have the gate open to the public, you do not need to get approval from us. And just finally to note that public access and event policies are subject to change as things evolve with the pandemic.
Awesome. So yeah, we'll be talking about some different examples of community engagement, activities, and things that you can do in your community garden or school garden. Both things that are like completely virtual as well as things that are socially distant or safely done in person, and some like hybrid of the two. So we'll be talking about some examples, but I think just to get us started, we wanted to hear from you all either what types of engagement activities did your garden do in the before times, and how have they changed during COVID-19? And what types of ideas do you have to engage your community during this time? So yeah, we'll just open it up for some discussion. And if you're not part of a community garden right now, maybe what types of activities have you seen other gardens in your neighborhoods do that look exciting or have been effective? You're welcome to come off mute if you like, or put it in the chat.
I can give an example from a garden in the region that I work with. So one of the gardens I work with in Staten Island is pretty new. It's only a couple years old, and they have been doing a lot of work to grow more food for the community. And pre-COVID times, they had educational beds at the schools around them, would utilize during the week for classes and for education purposes, and the kids would get the food that they grew. So they, during COVID, now have shifted a lot of those beds to be like full food production for the community. And so they've been working to donate that food to the community fridge that's in their neighborhood, where anyone can access the food in that space, along with a food pantry in the neighborhood.
Awesome. Very cool. Totally. So I think we've seen a lot of really creative ways that community gardeners have been adapting, like Anthony shared, to be able to continue to engage their community and be resources for their community. So yeah, if folks have any other examples that you want to mention, offhand, I know with some of the gardens in my region, in North Brooklyn, I've seen some really great ways that gardens have also done food distribution, following the policies on our website to do it safely. But even while the garden's gates were closed, like using the sidewalk and ensuring that they were able to help support with mutual aid work in their community, particularly during this time, or even seeing more community gardens posting on social media about updates about their spaces and showing how they're continuing to maintain and steward these really important public spaces, even in the beginning of the pandemic when the gardens were closed to the public. And as Anthony mentioned, now gardens have the option to open based on their comfort level of the garden group for the time being. So there's a wide range of activities and things that garden groups can do. Go for it.
Yeah, Jessica. So I just started the Friends of Crocheron and John Golden Park in the beginning of August. And so we kind of got into everything during COVID and have been thinking about things during COVID. And partly because my background is in history, I wanted to do a timeline of the park. So talking about the history of that specific area. So I have that on the website now, and we're trying to figure out a way to make that into like more of a virtual outdoor kind of thing that people can do with the history. And then one of the other things that we're thinking about, and what our park administrator said would be useful, is doing a scavenger hunt kind of thing, so that people would be able to go around and with their family, socially distanced, check out, find this tree or find this plant kind of thing. And he said that he went to, I believe it was the Bronx Zoo with his boys, and they had something very similar there, and that the guys were really into it and that they were running around having a good time. So trying to, I guess, think outside the box a bit. And I'm looking forward to working with you guys a bit, as well as with partnerships for the parks, just to understand more about what we can do with the garden beds that we do have. And then I am hoping there's some area that doesn't seem like it's used very well, to, in a year or so, to clear that out and make that into some kind of garden area as well. Because I know that, at least in my area, I do see people doing picking roots and other things like that. And I feel like there's a lot of knowledge in the community, and it's a good way to kind of bring everyone together right now in that way. So I'm really excited to work with you guys more and learn more about gardening and garden beds and how that all connects with the community, because it's definitely needed. And yeah, so that's just the two things that we're thinking about doing that is helpful during COVID. And I'm not as into the social media with being able to monitor things, but I do see it from other friends groups that they're having a really good time being able to engage with people that way and kind of creating that community sense too.
Totally. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing, Jessica. I think hearing some of those examples, that's great to, yeah, think creatively, like you said, outside the box. And that like some of these types of engagement activities can totally be used in normal times too, if and when things ever resume. So with the timeline, was that an in-person activity or what did that, was like an art installation?
So the timeline right now, it's on just the website, and we have one member who's on the board of the Bayside Historical Society, and the Bayside Historical Society agreed to partner with us with that. So we're going to be able to get some photographs and things. I'm not sure how accurate it will all be, but I was hoping to be like, oh, from this spot in 1968, there was the Philharmonic Orchestra, and there was 20,000 people, they said, went to the park. So kind of bringing that bit of history in and just something different, since, that's kind of what we got to do now, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think connecting with place and history and like having folks understand more about like, the place that you're stewarding, I think is always a really good way to generate interest and excitement in the long term. And build, more of a volunteer base of folks who can help with stewarding the park and the garden. So awesome. So we will pass it over to Anthony then.
All right. So we're going to spend the bulk of our time in this presentation talking about different examples of virtual community engagement and also passive engagement strategies that you can do like in your space without having large groups of people gather. So we're going to talk more about like giveaways that groups can do to connect to their neighborhood, social media engagement, art displays, virtual garden tours and self-guided tours in person, and then virtual and hybrid in-person workshops that you can do at your garden. So next.
And I think the other piece to keep in mind is like these are all varying levels of like planning involved. So we start from like super simple with something like social media all the way up to planning virtual or in-person events. So there's a wide range of things that you can do based on your garden group's capacity or interest level, and all of which are good ways to like invite more people into the space, either virtually for now or in the long term to become members of the garden or be part of your garden's like base of support. So yeah, I just wanted to share, here's an example from Kew Gardens in Flatbush, Brooklyn. They have hosted a plant giveaway at their garden. This was in May. They were giving out seedlings to neighbors and passersby of the garden. And this is like one of many types of things that garden groups can give away to neighbors. And it's a nice way to get neighbors excited about gardening while also staying socially distant and wearing masks so that you can see people are spaced out like 6 feet apart. And also they did a nice social media post about their giveaway. So over 110 people liked it, and there's other community gardeners chiming in and building, cross-borough support there. And yeah, this is another way to also think about ways to be a resource to neighbors who maybe don't have a plot themselves, or if you're giving away flowers, for example, or things like that. So if you have some communal beds in your garden, there's still a way to kind of like share the resources and benefits of community gardens to the broader public. I've also seen some community garden groups host plant distributions either as fundraisers themselves, so they can like grow seedlings and sell them, or just check our GreenThumb handbook for policies around selling agricultural produce, etc., or as free giveaways like they did here. So there's benefits of either approach. And another similar example of giving away items to the public are like little libraries. So these are a couple different examples in different community gardens in Brooklyn. Vinegar Hill Community Garden has been giving out non-perishable food items with their little library on their garden's fence. Prospect Farm has been giving out free seeds, which looks like they've actually saved the seeds themselves and packaged them to distribute and trade with other members of the public or to give away. And First Quincy Community Garden in Bed-Stuy has books that they've been giving out to neighbors or trading. So that's a really nice way to kind of engage neighbors on the block and build a tighter sense of community with people who might be passing by the garden and feel invited to participate in a small way or to eventually come inside the garden itself. And it's a nice way for community gardeners to also plug into mutual aid work that we've seen all across the city for folks who are helping with food security efforts right now. And there is a Little Libraries movement, and that you can check out tools on Little Library national website for how to make one of your own to go on the garden's fence. And there is also just like a strong tradition of seed saving with community gardens and across the country with different growers. So New York City's public library system also has some ways that you can learn more about seed saving and sharing there. I also wanted to share one last example here of like items to distribute and give away. 9th Street Community Garden has a really amazing program that they've been working on this season to both save seeds and then to use them as a fundraiser to sell and give away with a local artist who helped create the design. So this is a really nice way to kind of uplift the work that community gardeners do, as well as to help bring in some funds to manage the space and help steward the garden. So those were a couple of some of our favorite examples we've seen thus far.
I would also mention that GreenThumb also does seed saving workshops pretty often. And so like the 9th Street Garden got a lot of their seed saving knowledge and skills from attending our earlier webinars in March, April, and May.
Great. So I'm going to touch lightly on social media presence. Like we all know, social media can take all different forms, and it could be as simple as you want or as involved as you want it to be. And we could do a whole workshop on it. But we want to highlight some of the ways that community gardens have been using social media to engage the community. So as we think about social media, it can feel like a heavy lift for garden groups because you're taking care of a physical space, you're organizing the group, you're trying to build culture, you want to have an event. And so it can feel sometimes like social media can be an extra step to take. But as we're learning during this time of the pandemic, when people can't always show up to the space, that they can still remain connected. So this is a great way for gardens to be able to really reach beyond their gates and stay connected to not only their members, but their community. And there are lots of benefits for it. Is that if you have a group that is active on social media and you are doing a volunteer project, it's a great way to promote it and get new people to come in and see your space, and ultimately a way to show activity that might be really helpful for our new members to get to know the culture of the garden, because that's usually what people are drawn to. Like, yes, we want to grow food. Yes, we want to hang out in spaces. But a lot of times people are looking for community, so they can kind of see if it's a good match. So some things to consider with social media is you can have a seasonal social media where you think about what are some things you want to highlight in the spring, in the summer, and in the fall, and even in the winter, and trying to keep like a really good rhythm to your posts so people kind of are able to get to know the voice of the garden. I always recommend that one person should be in charge of social media. You should have other people involved, being able to take pictures. You can also integrate it into events that you plan to do. And GreenThumb's always here to support our group. So if folks let us know ahead of time that they are going to do a post, we can also cross post with you to kind of echo out the message. But one thing that is really nice for gardens to do is to pick maybe a unique feature of their garden to highlight. And in this great example, we have Woody Crest Community Garden up in Highbridge in the Bronx, and they heavily feature a lot of their chickens, and not just the very, very cute chicken and their very, very cute eggs, but also their members interacting with their chickens, because some people don't know that you can keep chickens on your community garden. And this picture is really great because you'll see our members interacting with them. People get really excited about it. And so we encourage groups that there may be something that is special about your garden that you want to highlight. So if your garden has a really cool history, that's something that you can do and highlight throughout your social media. Maybe you have some really cool plants. Maybe you have specific cultural plants that you're growing. There are lots of really great ways to do it, and I definitely would recommend for garden groups who maybe are new to follow other gardens. You can also follow GreenThumb and see some of the great posts coming out of the gardens and learn from each other. So it can be intimidating. It can seem like a lot of work. For some people, it is a full-time job, but it absolutely does not have to be. You can post, take turns posting one picture a week of your garden, and figure out ways to really engage folks as they look to your garden as a space for community, especially during this time. Cool. So I think we're ready to move on. We'll definitely have time for questions too, as we talk about social media.
So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about some passive in-person engagement that garden groups in the Lower East Side / East Village of Manhattan have been doing. So we're going to mostly talk about an event called the Harvest Arts Festival that Loisada United Neighborhood Gardens, or LUNGS, holds every year. LUNGS is a coalition of gardens in the East Village that works to plan events across all of the gardens and also does advocacy work with the gardens. I should note the Lower East Side / East Village of Manhattan has 50 gardens in a really concentrated area, so they have always been a pretty tight-knit community, with some blocks having 3 to 4 gardens just on their block. And so the Harvest Arts Festival traditionally is a weekend of arts, programming, performances, workshops that happen across all of the gardens in that neighborhood. And obviously during the before times, these workshops and events took place inside the gardens with like large crowds of people, and it was a great opportunity to engage their neighborhood and to just kind of help spread the word that the gardens exist, and that they're a great place for the neighborhood to get involved. So this year they've had to pivot since many of the gardens didn't feel comfortable having their space open for the weekend. And so as you can see in this photo, a lot of the garden groups did art installations on their fences, including in one of these photos, they did some chalkboard drawing where they asked people in the neighborhood to talk about their hopes and dreams for the upcoming year and post-election. Gardeners also installed blank canvases on their fences with art tools set up near the canvases so people in the community could interact and make their own art. And so you can see in one of the examples, someone did a little tribute to Ruth Bader Ginsburg on their garden fence. And then there's another example of a garden that was closed that wanted to make sure everyone knew that they are still around with their little sunburst on the sidewalk. These are just great ways for these community gardens to interact with their community, even though they're closed, and to remind the community, that they're still around, that there's still places that people can get involved with even while they're closed to the public. And let's go to the next slide. The next slide shows more interactive art installations, specifically from the 9th Street Community Garden, which we mentioned earlier, that is doing seed saving work. They also pretty much every year install these dioramas on their fence that are viewable through the fence. As you can see in the photo, there's some people in the neighborhood who are taking a look at the dioramas. You can see how they're set up along their fence line, and then there's a photo of what they look like on the inside. It's a really great example of the garden partnering with a local artist who loves to create these dioramas, and it's a great place for them to display them, especially right now. I will note this garden is closed to the public right now, but if you live in New York City and you happen to be in East Village, those dioramas are still up if you want to go take a look at them. So these are just a couple examples of what some gardens in the East Village have been doing to engage with their community. Others have done film screenings on the side of the building that they're next to that are visible from the sidewalk, showing like plants and other short films. And I think, you know, they've just been really great ways for the gardens to still stay connected to people who are not necessarily members of their gardens. So next are virtual garden tours. GreenThumb has been encouraging garden groups during the pandemic to record tours of their gardens for the public. GreenThumb has been posting a lot of those tours on our social media, specifically on our Instagram. So if you are on Instagram, definitely take a look. They're in our IGTV section, and you can find lots of tours of gardens across the city. It's a really great way to broaden your reach, especially if you're a New York City garden and you want to share it with GreenThumb. You know, we will obviously share it with our audience as well. We always think it's a good idea, if you're going to do virtual garden tours, to start with an intro from the member who is giving the tour, talking a little bit about the history of the garden, maybe why the member is involved in the garden and what brought them there, and then a quick walkthrough of the space, pointing out any of the really unique features in your community garden, and talking about the work that they're doing. So in this slide, you can see some screenshots of a tour that some Bronx gardens did with a nonprofit in the Bronx community called Bronx Green Up. I'm going to put a link to the YouTube in the chat in case you want to take a look at it. It's a really highly produced video tour. You do not need to make tours as produced as these. They could be literally just you walking through in one shot, showing people the spaces, but they can also just be as beautiful and produced as these are. We will also send you links to these afterwards, so you can look at them at any time. And I think they're really just a great way to bring people into a garden space that may not be open to the public right now. And finally, I'll just say one quick thing about virtual garden tours. If you are a gardener in New York City and you need support on doing virtual garden tours, definitely touch base with your outreach coordinator. We can help support you with some tips and tricks and tools for recording those tours, and for how to get them to GreenThumb to post as well.
Awesome. So similarly to the virtual garden tours, gardens can host virtual events and workshops. So we've seen a number of really amazing examples from gardens across the city. East New York Farms has hosted several different virtual events and workshops. Here's an example of a virtual cooking demonstration. We also had a number of gardens participate in hosting events on Open Garden Day earlier in the summer with GreenThumb. It's an annual event. This year we shifted it to be virtual. So here's a musical performance that GreenThumb hosted in a community garden, Brooklyn Bears, Carlton Avenue Garden, that was live streamed and available for viewing by members of the public on social media. So this is another way to engage neighbors and members of the public through watching online, whether it's on Instagram, Facebook, or another platform. And this can also be done as a hybrid event. Like you could have some members of the public safely entering the garden up to the capacity, and then from there also live stream it so other people can participate or watch or tune in, even if they don't feel comfortable entering the space. So there's a lot of different options, but it's a really nice way to continue to host events and programming. And another thing to keep in mind is to think about like what types of activities or events you've done prior to this, and think about how they can be adapted to a remote setting. So whether that is cooking demonstrations, plant medicine workshops, gardening 101 skills, different craft projects, working with things grown in the garden, there's tons, or musical performances. There really are tons of options and ways that you can get creative with showing people about the many benefits of community gardens. And again, garden groups can now host socially distant in-person workshops, but please fill out the event listing request form on GreenThumb's events FAQ page. So ask your outreach coordinator if you do have any questions with that. And yeah, we've also been doing this with a lot of GreenThumb workshops. So for example, with our chicken care training series we had earlier in the summer, we had an instructor who was physically at a garden, showing us the chickens that they were working with, while also having slides and information on his phone, but live streaming to the audience and participants who were tuning in from home. So it's pretty neat to be able to still teach about various topics related to community gardening while folks can stay safe and socially distant. So really endless possibilities with types of activities you can do. And we've just presented a few different options, but again, starting with what your garden's feature is, what excites you and your membership, and really going from there is always a helpful starting point. I'll also just mention a few examples of resources that we have on the GreenThumb website for hosting and planning events. These are for in-person events, but they also are applicable for virtual events. So there's a couple different ones. Event Planning on a Shoestring walks through a lot of different roles and logistics in thinking about planning a successful event on a budget. The Run of Show template also walks through day of logistics, thinking about all the different pieces to consider and to really involve your group in planning an event together and delegating different roles. And then finally, the GreenThumb events FAQ page has a lot of commonly asked questions, and you can find information about what might be required for different settings, and just different tips and best practices for hosting effective events. So we will also send these out in the recap email so you can take a look through them, and you're also always welcome to reach out to your outreach coordinator or the GreenThumb info account if you have particular questions, and we're happy to chat further. But yeah, for now, we have plenty of time for questions and discussion.
I did also want to just note for everyone who may be new to GreenThumb webinars, we've been doing them since March, since we all started staying at home. So we have been recording all of them, and you can view pretty much every workshop we've done at the link that I just put in the chat, including we did some workshops on how to use Zoom with breakout rooms and polls and all that kind of stuff. So if you are thinking about ways to engage your community virtually, through workshops or webinars or just holding meetings for your garden group. We do have some like previous workshops that you can view that might be great resources. So there was a question in the chat about has any community garden ever done a farmer's market to raise money for them? Yes, so there are a variety of farmers markets and farm stands at community gardens across the city. Some are just farm stands where they're selling produce that the garden has grown. Some are selling produce from outside farmers as well, and working with GreenThumb to get approved to do that work. And then others are CSA distribution points. CSA stands for Community Supported Agriculture. So there are ways for our community members to get like a box of produce every week from a farm or from the community garden, and pick it up at the community garden or right outside of it.
Okay, well, we'll definitely send a recap out with the different resources and links to information we mentioned. I personally want to go check out 9th Street's dioramas before they're taken down. Those look really awesome. But yeah, I think there's a lot of different options like we mentioned. So, you know, you can get creative and have fun with it all. Yeah, we'll be available to chat for a little bit longer if folks have any other questions. But if not, thank you for tuning in.